Thank you all for joining and welcome to this panel discussion. My name is Magda Matetovic. I work at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics, and I'm a student advisor in ManyBabies. I'll be today's moderator, but before I start introducing the panelists, I will tell you briefly about the structure of this event. So today we will talk about piloting in research with young children. We gathered the questions that you sent when you signed up, and we structured them into 5 topics. So we are going to go through these topics and discuss the questions. And then at the end, we will have 20 minutes for the audience to ask even more questions. But as Heidi said, feel free to ask questions also in between, either by raising your hands or putting your questions in the chat. And now I'm happy to say welcome to our panelists. First, we have Beth Neff, who works at the University of Oslo, and she is the lead of the pilot reporting task force. In particular, she is leading working groups investigating current piloting practices across psychological subfields. And she focuses on promoting greater transparency and reporting of pilot studies. Next, we have Krista Byers-Heinlein, who is a professor at Concordia University, where she directs the Infant Research Lab. She has been piloting and conducting studies with infants for more than 20 years, and she also published numerous papers on methodological issues and their solution in infant research. Then we welcome Tashauna Blankenship, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Psychology at UMass Boston. Her lab's research often involves novel designs, and given the task novelty, she uses pilot studies to assess feasibility, but also to refine her designs. Then we have Lisa Oakes, who is a distinguished professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of California, Davis. She has regularly been using piloting in developing research paradigms and in developing stimulus sets for her research with infants. And lastly, we have Agata Bochynska, who works at the section for open research at the University of Oslo Library. She has worked with different types of piloting in psychology and psycholinguistics, and she has done in-lab and online studies where she has used piloting. She's now focusing on improving transparency of pilot reporting, and she works together with Beth Neff in the pilot reporting task force. So these are our panelists. Thank you so much for being here. I will start with the first section, which is the goals of a pilot. I want to ask you all, what is the goal of piloting, and especially what is the goal of piloting in early childhood research? And perhaps we can start with Lisa.
So what is the goal of piloting? This is the question. I think there are several goals of piloting, right? So sometimes we use piloting to figure out if our stimuli are, like if there are preferences for our stimuli, or if babies can distinguish between stimuli. Sometimes we use piloting if we're not sure. Like lately, it's been a lot about we're trying to do a lot of things in a single session, and to see if we do piloting to see how many tasks we can run or what order things should be in. I think that logistics is a big part of piloting. But those are sort of the main reasons that we do piloting. I think one thing, I've been doing very similar. Somebody on the panel said they do lots of new things. We don't do a lot of new things anymore, right? So we don't have to do as much piloting to see how long our trials should be, or how many trials, because we've been using the same procedures for a long, long time. But when you move to a new procedure, then you have to do piloting on those sorts of things.
Tashauna, you raise your hand.
So I was the one who commented on using a lot of novel designs. So we've been doing a lot of work in our lab where we're studying episodic future thinking in children, kind of trying to come up with different ways to look at this. So we use piloting a lot just to see if, so the age range varies quite a bit depending on the task, but we can go as young as 2. So we use piloting as a way to make sure that children are actually understanding the types of questions that we're asking them, that it's a feasible design. If there are things that we can do to make it more engaging for them, making sure that the length of the task is appropriate depending on, whether we're collecting the data in lab. We also have tasks that we collect in museum settings, so we have to take that into consideration. So we definitely use it quite a bit for just kind of determining kind of the parameters of our task and whether it's appropriate for children of various age ranges.
Mary Beth, you can also
Yes.
directly ask your
Oh,
question.
okay. Okay. I have a very similar piloting approach to Tashauna. I too work with a lot of novel paradigms, and so I think a consequence of that is that a part of my research practice is that I always pilot. So before it was because I was always developing novel paradigms, and so I needed kind of that period of assurance to make sure that like the ideas that I had actually translated to real participants, especially working with children. So really making sure that the concepts or the tasks not only made sense to children, but also they were actually working with children, like children understood them in the same way that I wanted them to understand it, so that I was actually testing the construct that I wanted to test. But because of this, because I normally work with novel paradigms, even when I don't, I think I'm just used to always piloting. So like a rule of thumb is that I always test 1 to 2 participants. And this is usually after I test like 1 to 2 colleagues. So I'll use like a colleague to make sure that there are no kind of software bugs or technical issues, or to train my RAs. But my rule of thumb before I run any kind of large scale, I work with small samples, but any large scale study is that I want to see how a participant in my age range interacts with the method before I kind of invest in it.
This is actually a question that is asked a lot, and that is how many participants you test in your pilot. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know if this is directed to me specifically, but I tend to, because I have this rule of thumb where I always test at least 1 to 2, I tend to test kind of iteratively. So I don't have a specific sample in mind. I do have a threshold that if I feel like I'm piloting too much, then I really kind of just like stop and reevaluate. But normally I can kind of see that a method is not working within 2 subjects. Sometimes you have to, if you have working with really, really young infants, you need a little bit more. But I feel like with quite a small sample, you can already kind of tell that a method's not working. And I really try and not go too high because we have a lot of recruitment difficulty, but I will invest in piloting, and I won't necessarily like force a stop of piloting if I've hit a certain sample, because I want to make sure that my method is doing what I want it to do, not in terms of effects, but in terms of like participants are getting it. There are no like obvious flaws before I invest.
Lisa?
So I think it's a hard question about how many, because it really depends on why you are piloting. So if you're piloting to see whether or not, like in our case where we do a lot of looking time with babies, if you're piloting to see if you have an a priori preference, you basically have to run a whole study with a full sample, right? Where we did this recently and we ran a whole study with, I don't know, 40 kids, and we found we had a preference, and then we had to change what our stimuli were. If what you're doing is you're piloting something that you've done a bunch before and you're making sure that like you haven't introduced something weird, you might only need to pilot 1 or 2 kids. So I don't think there is a hard and fast answer, because it depends on what your goals are.
I see Krista raising her
Yeah,
hand.
thank you. And I think that Lisa has alluded to something that has remained unsaid. And what none of us do is test a few participants and then check for the effect that we're actually interested in, our hypothesized effect. So that is not something that I've heard here. And there's a really good reason for that. The reason is that the sample that you need to look at that effect is what, based on hopefully a power analysis, the full sample that you're going to run. That is the sample that you need to detect that effect. So if you look ahead of time based on 4 or 5 babies, and of course it's tempting, and we've done that, a undergraduate project, they only ran 5 participants, like, wow, what a huge effect. And then, well, it turns out when you run the full sample, you're very unlikely to find that same thing that you found with 5. Sometimes you're so excited, it's not necessarily going to be there in the same sample. At 5 or 3 or 2 or whatever that smaller sample is, you can't detect that effect. So when everyone's talking about feasibility, I think what we're talking about is other effects unrelated to our research question, like, does every baby hate my study? Are they going to cry halfway through? And those are like large effects that we can detect easily. Like if I test 3 babies and all 3 of them cry in the middle of the procedure, there's something wrong with my procedure. So I think it's that kind of thinking that we might want to have in thinking about how many participants do we need to pilot? How many do we think we're going to need to see whatever is we're hoping either will happen, like the babies happily sit through, or won't happen, like they don't want to do the task, they don't want to point at something, they don't want to engage.
Yeah, and I think that the question about the sample size links really tightly to the goal of the pilot. And I think that sort of echoes what Lisa said, that it really sort of depends what we want to test by the pilot. So it will vary a lot, but if you would be interested in some sort of data on that, we did run a survey on piloting practices in psychology in general. So this is not only developmental science, but developmentalists were actually a big portion of those who filled out the survey. I think mostly developmental and cognitive and social psychology. So I will link it in the chat, and we have some data actually on how many, like what is the percentage of researchers that would frequently or always use piloting for evaluating methods feasibility. So I think that's, Krista, what you were talking about, versus assessing a method's effect. And we are assessing methods effect much more rarely than the methods feasibility, also because all the issues that, Krista, you mentioned. But we also included categories like developing a method or technical pilot studies. And I think technical pilot studies are very frequent, where we want to check if the program is working, if the setup is working, like all the sort of technicalities, because once you run a study and then you get the data and you see that something was coded wrongly, then of course it's too late if you didn't run a technical pilot. So I think these technical pilots are very sort of frequent type of pilots that are maybe also run in addition to these other types of pilots. And in terms of the sample size, we also see quite a strong trend of pilot sample sizes clustering around from like 1 to maybe 50 individuals that we run pilots on. So I will put the link in the chat, and Beth will probably supplement what I'm saying.
Kind of. So I think this question of what are the goals you pilot mapping on to the sample that you need for the goals of the pilot, I think also touches on how you pilot in a way. I think what I didn't necessarily clarify when I was sharing my piloting practices is that I watch the participant. So I usually, if we're first testing a participant like in our age range, I am like there with my research assistant, either like behind the curtains or maybe even in the room. And I think the sample usually is much smaller if I'm there than if I'm just looking at a data sheet. I find that I need a little bit more participants and a little bit more feedback to be able to kind of infer or try and guess what's actually happening. But yeah, it really varies for me, at least in my personal practice, whether or not I have like the qualitative, the real kind of live data of the pilot, and then it's much smaller and faster in a way. Whereas I might want a little bit more information if I'm just looking at a data sheet.
Yeah, I want to jump in, and I think what Agata said about technical piloting is really interesting and important. And actually, interestingly, that's not something that I had use the word piloting to think of, but it's something that we always do in the lab, which is if there's something that any new study that's been programmed. The distinction I will make that in my lab, we would not recruit an infant or a child participant to do this. This would be something that first whoever's programming, the researcher RA would sit through the study many times, all the conditions, press all the buttons. Then we might have some other people sort of pretend to be babies or participants and see how that goes. I have a policy in my lab that I sit through every new study. I try to put my baby hat and my baby eyes on and really try to see it how they might see it, really just, paying attention to even things like visual salience and timing. And so that's a great point that there's probably a whole lot of sort of piloting you might want to do even before you would think of inviting a participant, given they are so challenging to recruit.
I think that's a great point, and that also speaks to all these various samples that we use throughout piloting and these iterative pilots. The only thing maybe I would add to that is that, of course, with infant studies, I think in some studies I would still recruit maybe one or two kids for the technical pilot just because of the height, for example, of how they're how they're sitting on their parents' lap, where their eyes or head would be more or less, right? Or on what level they would see. So I think that would be the only reason why sometimes after all these technical pilots with lab members, it would be maybe worth to do a one or two checks with the participants, with the actual population of participants. But at the same time, those participants are so precious, right? You don't want to use them for something that you can do with other types of participants.
I want to add something quickly about what Krista was saying about trends. Somebody asked, what about if you see something contrary to your hypothesis during piloting, what should you do then, and what do people do in practice?
So I'm not sure. Let me make sure I understand the question. So the question is, you run some pilot subjects, you look at the results to see if it conforms to your habit. I think, like Krista said, we never do that, right? We look at things like with our infants, like fussiness. Yeah, I mean, we would never look at the variables of interest for our hypothesis. That's not the point of our piloting. So
Yeah, I don't know if me or you, Tashauna, were first. Yeah, because I think the deeper question here is whether we should be looking at the results from pilots at all, right? I think that's the big question. And I think Lisa says that both her and Krista do not do that. But I think there are a lot of researchers out there who are very unsure about whether it would be appropriate, or whether maybe not doing that will result in overlooking something. And then there will be others that will say, like, no, this will result in completely biased, research design if you will base the improvement of your method on the actual result from the pilot. So I think it is not a trivial question, and also because I think we'll get in this discussion to the aspect of reporting pilots in publications, but because we are largely not doing that, a lot of early career researchers are very unsure about what is appropriate in terms of looking at data from piloting and what is ethical to do. So I think that is a big question that we as a community should resolve.
I completely agree, and I just kind of want to fall on a side of that. I would argue that it's incredibly inappropriate to change any of your hypotheses based on pilot data. As we've been talking so far, usually those sample sizes are incredibly small. And it's really, really hard to kind of draw any concrete conclusions based, or in general, but based on pilot data especially. So you should, if at all possible, try to limit yourself from looking at that data in that way. But I know that we can all see general trends in our data, and even if we're not trying to, but you certainly shouldn't change any of your existing hypotheses based on it.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And in my personal practice, I don't look for effects. I find that the line starts to get blurry in terms of whether or not you're piloting to get a method to produce an effect versus to make sure that it is like accurately testing for the existence of such an effect. That being said, where I think it can get kind of complicated in developmental research is that we expect participants to fail in developmental projects more than we do with like adult research. And I think it's important in piloting to see whether or not those failures are genuine. And I think it can be hard to tell because the failures might align with your hypotheses, but they can still also be just a consequence or a product of a method being flawed. I've had this in my own research where we were trying to see whether or not children can kind of understand or detect the plausibility of an utterance. And we had this practice trial where we expected them all to be able to do very well, where they just had to say whether or not an agent was real or pretend. And all children were saying everything was pretend, and like even up until like 9, 10. And for the younger kids, you might be like, okay, maybe they just can't engage in this type of reasoning. And like there's plenty of literature to support that being true. But in piloting, we learned, and we really invested quite a lot of time because we were really surprised. And we had just thought it was the product of our stimuli. But we learned it was because we used cartoons and that children were treating them very literally as cartoons. And so we finally asked a parent and a child, and they very kind of like sassily responded saying, like, his drawings aren't real. And so had we not invested in that process, we would have kind of like inappropriately, I guess, like inferred what the results meant. We would have assumed like, oh, okay, children are failing this task because they just aren't engaging in this type of reasoning. And that would have been perfectly reasonable to kind of assume given the research, but actually we just had this thing in the method where kids were just doing it very differently than we expected them to. So I think this is the area where it gets kind of complicated in terms of like the inferences that you're drawing. But I do think broadly having the goal of testing the effects is problematic in piloting.
I'm gonna insert here another question that is very interesting and that we received from several people, which is, what if everything goes all right during piloting? Do you include those participants in your final data sets? What are your thoughts on this?
So this is interesting and very related, I think, to the previous question, right? So I think that so I mean, I have the I've been doing this long enough that when I started, a lot of things were thought of as common, just sort of things that everybody did that now you would, oh, that's p hacking, right? The peeking at your data, that, whatever. And we learned from projects like ManyBabies and other kinds of things how replication of some of those findings, some are robust, some are not, right? And I think that's the thing that we are really, really concerned about. So when we talk about these sort of technical pilots or whatever, in my perspective, I mean, like I said, we always will check to make sure everything is happening with the first couple of babies, but we have a setup that has been the same for many, many years, 10 years, same eye tracker, same distance from the eye tracker, same monitor. So we know that it's only going to be because of something quite unusual if the first baby doesn't work. And like I said, as Krista said, and everybody else has said, we run it through internal people. We check to make sure that the data are analyzable or whatever. So we will check with the first few babies and make sure that things are going the way they have gone in our dozens of previous studies, but we don't have any problem including those first few babies in our study. The other thing that I will do oftentimes, and getting back, sort of relating this to the other issue of what if it tells you something about your hypothesis, is I try, if I think I'm going to need a relatively good sized pilot, I try to figure out some way to make it not be, to be included in the story that I'm trying to tell, right? So in Mary Beth's example, if you find that your instructions are producing one set of results, well, maybe you complete that as a study, and then you do another study where you use a different set of instructions, and then that's something that will tell you about what children are doing in this context or whatever. So, so I think it depends on what your what your goal is of your pilot, but if you get to, in your piloting, you get to a point where everything is the way it's going to be and you're not making any other changes. I personally don't have a problem with keeping all of those babies where everything happened in exactly the same way. If you discover 5 babies in that, oh, my attention getter is crap and I change my attention getter, then those first 5 babies don't get included. But if everything remains the same, then that's your real sample. And again, part of that is because of how expensive and difficult it is to get, in my case, infants into the lab.
Yeah, I have 2 things to add. First, just in response to Mary Beth's example, I think that was really nice. And I think that speaks to certain sort of manipulation checks you can have in certain studies, especially with older children and children who are verbal. You can ask them things as you're doing the task to see, like, do they just get what's going at all, never mind the specific manipulation that you're interested in. So I think that's great to include. And it is possible in some infant studies to do that, I think. So you have infants at a certain age, maybe you have some practice, familiar word trials, look at the ball, and you know that babies at this age know the word ball, and then later you're gonna have some other very much more interesting trials. It's certainly reasonable, I think, to check if you know kind of that you'll have a very large effect on that. If it's 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, to say like, oh, are they understanding this? Because I expect a large effect. I don't need a large sample to detect that. So that's like one thing you can do in piloting that. It again is different from looking at your hypothesis or your specific research question. Now, when it comes to sort of piloting and should you include those babies, I agree with Lisa that the only time you could possibly even consider including them is if you're not going to make any further changes, if your procedure is final. But I think it's very dangerous if you have looked at your research question and what is of interest of you, because it is very tempting, and we can't really stop ourselves from thinking like, oh, these aren't really the direction or results I was thinking. There must be something wrong with my study. I'm going to change something. And then I'm going to run 5 more again. Oh, these 5, oh, it really went in my direction. Oh, good. So I'm going to keep it the same and I'm going to continue. And if you do that, you really do risk biasing your results in your hypothesized direction. So I think there's a danger to that. Now, can you avoid that? Well, in my lab, we do a lot of eye tracking in paradigms that you just can't tell until you analyze the data which direction it went in. So, if we run 5 pilots, nothing's going to change. Nobody cried. Everything seems okay. And at that point, I don't know what happened with our manipulation. I think in that case, it's okay to go ahead and include those babies. But if it was a task, for example, with children where the person running the study can really see what the children are doing in terms of the hypothesis, I would really not recommend including those data because I think it could bias your effect size.
Maybe we can now move on to what to include in a pilot. And one of the questions we got is, do you pilot infants of different ages if you study a range of ages, or boys and girls if you study boys and girls, control and treatment? Do you do a pilot for each type of participants that you will include in your sample?
Yeah, I try to pilot according to the sample I'm going to test, especially because if it's about feasibility, you want to make sure that it's representative of the sample. That being said, I do try, because it is so difficult to recruit, I don't want to like waste all of my participants. So I try and like get at the younger end of the bracket and the older end of the bracket. And I will adopt a little bit more of a convenient sampling approach and less kind of like strict eligibility. So if I'm like testing, say, 4 to 6-year-olds and a 3-year-old comes in and an 8-year-old comes in, I actually will be more likely to test them to really kind of test the boundaries of my method to make sure that like the youngest participant, like there's like a clear, it's like clearly difficult for them in the way that I expected it to be difficult. And the 8-year-olds are like bored and it's like, it's appropriate. So I will be a little bit more kind of convenience driven in a pilot, but I do try and get the kind of bounds or boundaries of my age range. But that being said, it's like 1 to 2, or sorry, 2 to 3.
I wanted to share an approach that we have that I think might be of interest is, we recruit a lot of families, and we actually have a lot of babies for different reasons who don't quite meet our study inclusion criteria. Maybe they're a couple weeks too premature, a little bit low birth weight, or we wanted bilinguals, but they have 20% exposure to a third language. I find those are great babies to pilot with for feasibility, because they are still babies. They behave in babyish ways. And so we can still get a sense of the feasibility of the task without using a participant who we could normally include in the particular sample that we're looking for.
Related to this, someone asks if you assume that your pilot can be successfully completed by older children or by adults, do you also test this as part of your pilot?
I like I said before, I always pilot as a default. And I especially do this with adults, and I think more people should do this with adults because I'm sure many people have experienced adult participants really not getting your test in the way that you expected them to get it. So I think, at least as a developmental researcher, I definitely took for granted some of these tasks, and I was like, okay, yeah, if a kid will get it, an adult will surely do it, and I'll run a sample. And then they will like all be very confused about a certain question for like a very understandable thing, but something I just underestimated. So I for sure will pilot whatever age group I intend to kind of ultimately test.
So I kind of want to provide a different perspective. So I had a study that I conducted where the assumption was that an effect should be present in adults. And in fact, it had been found to be present. It was an attentional task in adults, but we had made some alterations to the task to make it appropriate for children. And we wanted to make sure that this effect that should be present in adults still, even using the simplified task, would still be there so that our task was actually measuring what we thought it was. We did run it in adults as well, in order to make sure that we were still seeing that original effect, even though this was a simplified task that children could complete as well. So I think considering, what you kind of expect the results to be, what's been established, and even if it's not an age range that you are planning to incorporate into your final project, if it's something that you're kind of just expecting to be there, also piloting for that as well.
What about doing a test retest? So common challenge is that there's high individual variability in infants. Do you ever retest during piloting?
Yeah, that's not something that we've ever done, but I will put a plug that the reliability of tasks is really important if you're looking for individual differences. But I don't think you can really estimate that reliability from just testing a couple of infants. That said, if you had a particular feasibility reason why you think, if you plan to test, children twice, and maybe you think that they're going to be very bored the second session, then it would be definitely worth doing what you plan to ultimately do.
Maybe the last question of this section, when is it good to stop piloting? Let's say you make alterations and then I hope you pilot again, but people are curious about how much time you should be spending on piloting. Do you decide this in advance? What criteria do you use?
I think that again connects quite tightly maybe to our discussion on the goals of piloting, because depending on what your goal is, you will stop when you reach the goal, right? So if the goal is to check all the technicalities because you run a technical pilot, you will stop when you see that your everything is outputting correctly, the experiment is running smoothly, there are no issues there. If your goal is to test methods feasibility, then you will stop when you see that everything is working the way it should. Of course, if your goal is to test if what the method effect is, then you will look at the results, which is problematic as we discussed, right? But whichever goal you choose, you will probably stop when you reach the goal. And of course, the big question is when is that? Because some researchers might assess this differently. And then we do know of some pilots that have huge sample sizes, actually, which to some of us might be surprising, but they sort of choose to actually test a large amount of participants to make sure that this sort of methods feasibility testing is really run correctly, and they don't waste a lot of data later on, right? But for others, it will be just 5 to 10 individuals, and they can stop there. So I think that will still vary quite a lot. And I think, Mary Beth, we also included a question about that in our survey. I don't know if we didn't have a qualitative sort of data on stopping. I would need to double check that maybe, but.
I think we did. I don't remember the data to be exact, but I mean, it was an opt-in question. I think a lot of people said it was based off of like intuition, or they had like a previous sample that was like their limit that they would allow themselves to kind of hit before they would go to a main study. I think some context that maybe I would want to add for this question is in trying to kind of decide how you stop piloting, I think it's important to understand how you, like what the piloting process looks like for you. For me personally, a lot of my research decisions, again, because I work with novel paradigms, a lot of my research decisions are kind of in the abstract, and I kind of push quite a lot of final decision making until I start collecting data. And so there tends to be this like fervor that happens like the second piloting starts, whereas like what we were taking kind of months to discuss, we're now giving ourselves like hours to days. And what I've had to kind of like learn is that there's just something when you start data collection that just like really everyone wants to kind of like drive that momentum, and you feel like you're spending more time on things than you actually are. And so what I've tried to do is that when I like first test a participant that's like actually like a child or an infant and not a colleague, is that I limit recruitment to 1 to 2. And I always have like at least an hour or 2 in between participants. And I really try not even have 2 on the first day, so that we have plenty of kind of decision-making time after the first participant to see whether or not we need to kind of like completely revisit this or test this. And so I do kind of have an upper limit where I try and like, if I've reached, I don't know, like 8 to 10, I'm like, okay, something is with this method. I really need to kind of go back to the drawing board for. But I think more so what I try and do is just allow decision-making time to not kind of get wrapped up in that process of really trying to kind of progress things, because it tends to happen to me, at least when data collection starts.
So again, I think it's highly variable and is going to depend on a lot of different factors. So our first experiment that we ran using head-mounted eye trackers, we didn't have a set amount. Like we knew we needed to learn how to do this. We had never done it before. So we ran some kids where everybody was sitting on the floor. And that turned out to be a disaster. So then we set up a situation where we had the babies in a baby seat, and they were sitting at a table, and that was good. But we gave them these really big, we had this brilliant idea. We were going to give moms these really big books to read. And it turned out that moms didn't know how to read to their 9-month-olds, these really big books. So then we had to change. And so we probably ran 40 pilots. I mean, and we had to learn how to put the headgear on the kids. We had to learn how to calibrate. We had to learn all of this stuff. And there's no way we could have done this in 1 or 2 kids. Now, when we ran our next study, I think we said ahead of time that we were going to have 4 pilots or something like that. And then we were going to reevaluate and make sure. And we did make some changes. We were asking them to do too much, but we could have that a priori. We're going to run a certain number of kids and then we're going to check, because we already had worked out a lot of the big logistic details in a previous study. Another case, what we did, we're going to run a longitudinal study where we were going to have multiple eye tracking. These were toddlers. They were playing with puzzles. They were doing all sorts of things. And we were going to run this big longitudinal study. But we didn't want to invest in that big longitudinal study until we were sure that our tasks were really going to work. And in this case, we did want to know kind of what the results were going to look like, because the longitudinal study was going to answer some different questions. So we ran a pilot that had 100 kids in it across the age range of our longitudinal. And that pilot now is publishable. Right now we have a cross-sectional sample with this 100 kids with all these different tasks. We'd made some refinements to the task based on those 100 kids, and we ran the longitudinal sample. And that is now a second sample that it sort of builds on the cross-sectional sample. So if you do, with our head-mounted eye tracking, those first 40 kids, there was just nothing we could do about it. But if there is a way, if you need to run a big sample, if there's a way you can do it so that it's not just, okay, I ran 100 kids and now I know that I have to do things in this order, but you actually end up with something that you can that you've learned about the thing you're interested in from it, and you can possibly, not everything in that was publishable, but definitely there were some things that we were able to then not just refine our tasks, but also say something about development in that age range from that cross-sectional study. And that to me seems like then you're not feeling like you're just wasting, not that it was a waste, but all those graduate students who were working on their degrees at that time got something out of it.
Speaking of pilots with a little bit bigger samples, people are wondering whether they could use their pilot to run a power analysis. What are your thoughts on that? Have you heard other people doing that? Do you do that, or do you think that this is not a good idea?
I mean, we're using the results from that 100 per kid pilot to do power analyses for our follow-up. I mean, it seems, that was part of it too, right? Is to sort of figure out how do kids do and what are our effects? Are we going to get big effects or small effects or whatever?
I would just kind of following up on that. Lisa has a really large pilot sample, but if you have a very small sample, then I think it can be a little trickier, especially if you have a small sample with very few trials, because your effect size might not be very representative of what the actual, effect is. And so it can really heavily impact what that power analysis tells you. So I think that it's a tricky situation, but I'd love to hear others' opinions too.
But yeah, I have to agree that infants and children's behavior are just highly variable. And so when you have a small sample, whatever effect you measure, that's exactly why you can't draw a small conclusion, because of the variability. And that's why you need a big enough sample. So I really wouldn't recommend running a power analysis off any kind of small sample, whether a pilot sample or another sample. In Lisa's case, she had a large sample, even though it was a pilot. And so she would have some stable effect sizes that she could use.
I also feel that this question is coming from the place of there was a time when this was recommended, right? I think there was a time when researchers were actually recommended to run a power analysis based on a preliminary study or a pilot study. But I think then we realized that, of course, those are small sample sizes, small effect sizes, and it's very problematic. So I think it's also a part of how the field is developing in terms of methods and awareness around different statistical analysis and different tools that we have. In our work with yet another collaborator of mine and Mary Beth, we're also looking into some journal guidelines around piloting. And I think, I don't know, I haven't verified if that's still the case, but I think psychological science is saying that it's not appropriate to base sample size solely on small pilot studies, for example. So they sort of explicitly say that, which I think is implied that power analysis should also not be run on these pilot studies.
I will say, I think I totally agree, but there is also this other culture for those of us who apply to grants from the National Institutes of Health, because now we do have to talk about power analyses, and oftentimes those power analyses are based on whatever pilot data we have in our grant, and so it is this, right? So even if it's not like you're ending up doing a power analysis for the NIH grant that you might think, I really am not so comfortable with it. You still have, right? We're in a place where you kind of have to do it. So it is very problematic. And I would not run pilots just to do a power analysis. But if you have a large enough sample, then so how is that for a total conflict and whatever, and NIH, that's a whole nother story.
I agree. I will just jump in super quick to say that I completely agree, and it's really problematic. And I think especially in the field that has so many novel methods constantly and novel questions investigated, what is this power analysis supposed to be based on, right? I think it's a huge issue.
I see a raised hand from Casey.
Yeah, thanks. This is just a follow-up question to what the panelists have said. So it's a very common scenario, I think, to face two options. We can either base a power analysis on a small or medium-sized pilot sample, or on a prior study that is notably different from our study design. Both are bad options, but it's often what we've got. So shouldn't we make a judgment call about whichever one is most likely to provide a realistic, not made up estimation of power, even if we do decide it's that small to medium pilot sample? Wondering what the panel thinks on that.
I mean, what we've started to do in our work is we will look at the existing literature, we will look at whatever pilots we have, but then we power for the smallest effect of interest, right? So because we can't really know, right? So that's what we tend to do.
Yeah, as a complement to that, another option is a sensitivity analysis. So, I work with really hard to recruit populations, bilingual infants of certain ages. We're just never going to recruit 200 of them. That's not possible. So, sometimes we just look at what can we reasonably recruit, do a sensitivity analysis to see what is the effect that we could detect, and is that a reasonable kind of effect that we would be interested in, or is that just a really huge effect that we're just never going to find, and so maybe we should plan a study on something else. Unfortunately, sometimes it is just a pragmatic decision.
Yeah, I think I personally have started kind of simulating. So I look more at model feasibility and kind of like ignore effects and just look at, okay, what is the amount of data I need for my model to actually kind of converge given the effects that I'm controlling for. But I think that because of the very small kind of parameters that we feel like we have to operate in, that's why I think it's super important to kind of like tell people what you're doing. So like before, the norm was to kind of just like follow the closest paper, and that doesn't work out that well, depending on like you know, if that paper's old and has a small sample, blah, 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 but at least you have a citation that people kind of know where you're making decisions from. Whereas if you're using pilot data, it's much harder. People might assume that you've done more due diligence because you're like, oh, we've piloted and we've tailored it specifically to our study, but you actually don't really know what you did in your pilot. So I think that I wouldn't necessarily like condemn a practice universally, but I think it's important to like maybe offer that context. If you do, like, if you really are stuck and you have to use this kind of pilot to make a best guess, is to kind of provide that context so that we can kind of build this collective knowledge.
Yeah, I'm reminded of I think it was a quote from somebody who said, "We used to make up our sample size. Now we make up our power." And I find that to be an interesting sentence because it says something about the state of the art in power analysis. It's a hard issue, so I appreciate these thoughts. Thanks very much.
I would like to go back now to before starting a pilot. Do you usually pre-register your pilot? Do you ask for ethical approval for a pilot, or do you do this after your pilot?
So you should get IRB approval for any human subject data collection, regardless if it's a pilot or not. Technically, any type of data that you're collecting from a participant requires consent. So that's just kind of a starting point that I wanted to mention because I don't know if that's common practice, but it's certainly something that would go against the IRB to not have approval prior to data collection. And then in terms of pre-registering personally, I do not pre-register pilot studies, but I think that using the pilot studies as kind of justification for design choices is something that should definitely be included, or that piloting has been, conducted, and kind of the alterations that have been made is something that would be useful to include within the pre-registration.
Yeah, I would agree with Tashauna, and I also think on the topic of pre-registration, it's really interesting to think about like how pilots maybe should be declared transparently in one way or the other, or should we do it? I think the sort of dynamic nature of piloting goes a little bit against pre-registration and sort of freezing the plan for something, because that's the whole point of piloting, to sort of figure out and maybe make corrections after every single participant, right? So we don't really have a set plan until we are finished piloting. But piloting is, I think, really critical for coming up with that plan of planning very carefully our method and our procedures. And then, of course, ultimately also analysis, but again, without maybe looking exactly at the results from the pilot. What I think is a little tricky is that the need for pre-registering good plans might force researchers to pilot many times and extensively before they pre-register. So I think that's a really interesting question, how much the need to pre-register is sort of forcing researchers to go through many, many, many iterations of pilots so that they land that sort of final plan, because they're very anxious about having to change the plan later on. So they try to sort of perfect that, and then how much that actually spills into already running the experiment, right? Instead of piloting. So so maybe I will also throw that question back at the other panelists, what they think about it, because I think we are at the point when some researchers have started doing that or practicing that because of the increase of the pre-registration practice.
I mean, I can, so we try to only pre-register things that we are pretty sure we have a high level of confidence that we're going to do exactly that. We know ahead of time what we're going to do. And that can be very hard because the reality is a lot of research with infants is very exploratory. But one of the things that I have really tried to work on with my people is to, when we pre-register, is it's a transparency thing, right? So it's not necessarily the case that you have to say, our every our trials are all we're going. You don't have to specify every detail. You can say that in piloting, we're going to determine the right number of trials, or you can include the piloting plan and say where your final decisions are going to come. I mean, you don't want to do that with everything, but there might be some places where you're ready to go, but you're not sure if you're going to be able to get 48 trials from all babies, and you might need to cut your experiment in half. I personally think you could write that into your pre-registration. Some of this is coming from an editor's perspective too, where I see a lot of pre-registrations, and I see a lot of pre-registrations where people did something different than their pre-registration, but didn't change their pre-registration. And they have a very hard time knowing how to handle that in their papers. And I think some of the times those would have been things that if they had said, our plan is to give 48 trials, but if it becomes clear after the first handful of babies that that's too many, we're going to cut it in half or something, then they would be in much better shape when they were writing their paper, and they wouldn't be doing this weird backtracking. Obviously, pre-registration is meant to fix things so I'm not saying that the pre-registration should be all completely flexible, but there might be some things that you don't really know when you do your pre-registration, because you're going to need to do a little bit of piloting that you might be able to build into the pre-registration itself.
But I think that's exactly why most researchers will be tempted to hold off pre-registering once they have everything perfectly figured out. So I think, Lisa, I think it's really interesting what you're proposing, right? To incorporate that sort of last bit of piloting into pre-registration and just have it sort of conditional, right? Like if we do this, then this. But in reality, I think the absolute majority of researchers will just wait with pre-registering until they get through that last bit of piloting and they figure that out. And then maybe a little sort of danger there is that they will pilot too extensively to the point where they started already basically running the experiment, and then they're actually running replication in their actual study because that's safe to pre-register too, right? So that's just sort of my intuition that might be happening.
Let's now look into the reporting practices. So should people put their pilot in their manuscript? Where should they give these details, and how detailed should they be? Should they put it in supplemental materials or in the main manuscript? What are your thoughts about this?
I can start because I just want to briefly say what I think, and I'm really interested to hear others. But typically with piloting, as I kind of mentioned for the pre-registration, I would use it within the method section as kind of justification for choices that I made, especially given the primary use of piloting for me is to kind of refine my design. I would use that as a way to kind of say this is why I made this choice or that, but I typically do not include pilot data outside of that.
I will just say that this question links very nicely to that discussion on pre-registration. Also, because if we were transparently reporting everything we do in the pilots, then there is no issue, right? But in our work in the pilot reporting task force, we've been seeing that it's not a very common practice to report pilots, but also because we don't really know how to report pilots, or we also don't really have good tools for reporting pilots. So I will maybe just hand over to Mary Beth to maybe say a little bit more about what we found there and what we are working on there.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have solutions at the moment. I think precisely probably why there was interest in this panel, and even kind of what can be inferred by like the variability of practices, even among like pretty highly agreeing panelists. We still vary a lot. I think emphasizes the importance of reporting these practices more, because I think maybe traditionally we would have assumed it was more kind of normative when people did it kind of more similarly to each other. But we've also found that people don't even know that you can pilot or that people do this. And so I think the should is a separate question of the what and the how. So I think we should be more transparent, and we should kind of, because this practice is very important for us. And so it stands to reason it's important for people who are reading and trying to use and replicate your methods to know kind of like, what are the things you did? Because sometimes you did like very reasonable things and it just didn't work with the participant. And so it would be good for people to know that context. That being said, it's extremely difficult to figure out how to capture this meaningfully within a manuscript, given like the journal constraints. So this is what we're trying to work on, but I think it's something that like people should just innovate on broadly. But we are trying to figure out, okay, does this go as a standalone report, as an appendices to a manuscript? In the report that Agata linked, there was a little bit of a kind of minimal information that kind of psychological researchers agreed on, or had like some consensus on, in terms of what they think would be useful to know. And it was broadly speaking, like whether or not you piloted at all, and what was your kind of decision behind any changes. So like what was different between from when you first piloted and when you kind of ran the full study. But yeah, I think the how and the mechanics is a really important question. It's not something we should jump to really quickly, because of all these things that we're seeing with pre-registration and trying to kind of backtrack on like how to make these mechanics more feasible. But for sure, I think that we should be reporting and acknowledging these studies more.
And I think also from that survey that we run, I think it was really interesting that we saw a sort of consensus among researchers that yes, we should be reporting, that everybody would see the benefits of more extensive reporting of pilot studies, but nobody really knows how to do it, right? It's not really a part of the training or like the standard paper writing, right? So just what Mary Beth said, like, should it be included in the methods section in the article? Like that might take a lot of space to report it in detail. Should it be an appendix, standalone? We've been trying to develop a template for pilot reporting too. Maybe that could be sort of good tool for researchers to be able to report it. But I do think and believe that we could all really benefit from seeing how others are really doing it, and sort of agree on it. Would be easier also to agree on what's appropriate and what's a good piloting practice too.
I think this is really important in terms of talking about what should be reported and about transparency. And I have no idea what I hope this is not the way things are anymore, but it used to be. I mean, I have a vivid memory of standing at a poster at a conference and somebody showing me their beautiful results and saying, yeah, this was so hard to get. This is like the fourth experiment that we ran, and we had to, instead of it going left to right, we had to have the movement go right to left. And then we did another version where we changed the color of, and I was just like, holy moly, what are you, I mean, in my world, that was not something you would do, but that, and then the published paper was just that one thing. And it's like, well, were those pilots that, I mean, in this researcher's mind, they were failed experiments, but it to the extent that that is happening or has happened in the past, it's very, very, problematic. And if we knew that part of the standard in publishing would be that you would report your attempts, what you did to sort of get to that point, it would be harder for those file drawer studies. Not that it would be impossible, but that might make it something that is more difficult for people. Certainly you would not have people, hopefully, at a conference shouting to the world that they ran the experiment 4 or 5 times in order to get the one result.
Yeah, just piggybacking a little bit. I think a large kind of motivating ethos for our task force and why we kind of focused on reporting is that, I mean, even all of us in this panel have like alluded to our intuitions as to like what we agree is like okay piloting practices versus not, but people will do the things that we don't think that are okay piloting practices. And I think a knee-jerk reaction at times is to try and standardize an approach. It's like, okay, what constitutes piloting practices, what is allowed or not allowed? But again, as we've all kind of maybe demonstrated, it's like highly variable. It really depends on your sample, your research, your goal. And so that's why we kind of, instead of standardizing, we're going for operationalizing. So really, at the end of the day, trying to fix a standard isn't going, or trying to fit a standard isn't going to work for everyone. It's not necessarily going to capture all this information anyway. So encouraging reporting seems to be like the easiest and kind of like nicest way to kind of maximize the utility of this information and also see what people are doing kind of and how they're investing in their studies.
And I remember when we started discussing it with Mary Beth, now it will be almost like 2 years ago, I think. And we were actually really surprised when we realized that is nobody requiring it really? Is nobody like, there's no discussion around reporting or encouraging reporting pilot studies. And we did also in the task force, we did do like a quick search through the like 20 top psychology journals, if there's anything on that. And there was almost no, there was maybe one single mention, that mention that I said earlier from Psychological Science, but and I think Nature Human Behavior only requires reporting pilot data for register reports, and that's basically it. So that's also interesting that there is also no mention of that, even though we pilot so extensively in psychology in general, and of course in developmental psychology, maybe in particular when we work with these types of populations. So I think that's also interesting that there is not a lot of discussion around sort of encouragement of these kinds of reports.
FYI, at Infancy, which is the journal that I edit, piloting is only talked about in the context of registered reports. It's not required, but it is discussed there. So I'm happy to have a conversation about how we could change things.
This was the last topic on my list. Thank you very much for this very insightful discussion. I would like to start now with the questions from the audience or any comments you want to add on what has been discussed. So feel free to either write in the chat or raise your hand and I will pick your questions.
I'll jump in just while people are maybe gathering their thoughts with something someone put in the Google Doc. There's a question about how to include pilot data in like a grant proposal, when we've talked about how you shouldn't look at your like hypothesis or question of interest in pilot data. So if anybody wants to touch on that sort of conflict.
I mean, you have to. I mean, it depends on the granting agency, but at NIH, you have to show that you're going to get the effect that you're proposing. So you have to show, but that kind of piloting that I do is not, would not be, that wouldn't be the piloting for actual study. That would be, I'm going to look at the data from these 10 subjects to show that these 10 subjects are showing the effect. I might not even have, I'm certain wouldn't have any analyses or whatever, but it's a sort of proof of concept kind of thing. And then when I would run the real study, I would start all over again.
Yeah, I can say that it really does depend on the granting agency. So the agencies I submit to here in Canada, that's definitely not a requirement. And instead you might point to a related study that you did that might be foundational for the next study. So yeah, I would get advice from more senior people who've submitted to these agencies and to a degree where poor practices are somehow required by the agency, you're just going to have to play that game with them a little bit, and hopefully, in your own research practice and what you know, and actually what informs your science, you can really take the approaches that you know to be more rigorous.
Maybe related to this, someone was
Right.
asking, how do you found your pilots if you don't have a grant already?
Yeah, I think funding is a whole other question, and I think definitely depending on your context, where you are in the world, the type of institution, what's available for you, that's a really complicated question. So, it also depends on what kind of funds you need to fund a pilot. So are you talking about personnel costs? If you don't have a grant, maybe students are able to do for credit work that might support that. If you're talking about participant gifts, that's a little bit trickier. Maybe you have participants who are happy enough with more inexpensive gifts. If you need equipment that's expensive, then that's a whole other story that it's a little bit of a catch-22. But that's I guess what startup funds or sharing with another researcher might permit.
Any other questions or comments?
I just wanted to add a quick response to NIH and requiring pilot data. It is possible to make arguments for NIH grant applications for the feasibility of your results using past data outside of piloting. So I at least know for myself, I had published data that I was able to use. So there are alternative ways to get that data. Obviously, piloting might be quicker and easier, but I think that it could also be like possible to use past work that you've done to also justify that you could find that similar pattern. I don't know if it's, and maybe I'm just naive, but I don't know if it's 100% fair to say that you have to use the pilot data for that justification.
Yeah, so you're right. There are lots of times, but there are also times when you don't have any other so yes, to the extent that you can, you can rely on previous findings or whatever, but that sometimes you have a grant. I mean, and NIH likes innovation, but they also like it to be safe. And so, uh, so there are times when you basically have to say, here are these. I've had a program officer tell me, well, as you're finishing up this one grant, just on the last 10 kids, just have them do something and then you can put that in as justification. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, I know Juja's reviewed a lot more NIH grants than I have, so she might have more to say about this, but that's been my experience is that at least sometimes you have to rely on some small pilot but like I said, I try to do it more as a proof of concept rather than here are 10 subjects, here's a F test, here's an effect size.
That's very much in conflict with what we said in the first part of the panel, right? Of how we should not rely on the sort of effects from these small pilots, also because they can be very misleading and we can actually get the grant agency to fund something that is actually very not reliable and will completely not show the effect because it popped up randomly because of the small sample, right? So, but I think that's a systemic issue with just the general issue with how research is being funded and how researchers are basically forced to do that, right? And then they just have to follow this practice because of these requirements. So so that's not to speak to, you know, researchers are doing something wrong, but more that they are pushed to do that.
I see a question from Zusa.
Yeah, hi everyone. Now that I've been called out, I feel like I have to chime in. Thanks everyone for a great discussion. So I was on an NIH panel as a regular member for 4 years, and so I think that's what Lisa was bringing up. As me being some kind of expert here, I think I'm on a side with the folks who are saying that it's probably not something we should be using as a rule of thumb, like, you know, using pilots unless they're large, you know, just like all of you have said. So I think we have some pretty good, you know, references, papers that you can cite from biostatisticians and also from, you know, folks that are in our field as well, who say that, you know, pilots are not the ideal thing to base your power analysis on, but the smallest effect size, just like Lisa said, like a while back, the SSOE is the best rule of thumb, and you know, pilots are just one thing that goes into your thinking about your large scale study, but not for the power calculations. So agreeing with a bunch of things that have been already said. Thank you.
And something that I would like to add in thinking about sort of funding and what to do for your NIH grant is that there are funding opportunities that are kind of for pilot studies. They're never called pilot, but sometimes they're called seed grants or feasibility grants. Sometimes these are internal to institutions. They're small amounts, or sometimes they are from funding agencies. So sometimes they're like high risk, high reward targeted at something like that. So these can be mechanisms you can look at for, not for piloting 5 children, but for some kind of larger pilot.
Can I just chime in really quick, because you said high risk, high reward, and that's like the exact you know, terminology for the R21 grants in the NIH world, for those of you who are in the US. And oftentimes in the description, you know, people like this part that it says, oh yeah, this is high risk, high reward. So, and it even says pilot data not necessary, meaning that it's like you can have such great ideas that you can have barely any prior work. And I just want to tell you guys here in this room, as someone who has been on these NIH panels a lot, that's really, don't take that very seriously. So you always need pilot data. In essence, you know, the way that how the system works is they between all the different R21 applications, there, you know, there will be many others who will have, you know, quite a bit of pilot data. So the reviewers are still using their very conservative hats in that, even when it comes to R21. So just wanted to stick that in, just because Krista used that word, that term, and R21s are great mechanisms for us developmental folks in the US, as long as NIH still continues to exist. You know, so I encourage people to think about it, but don't fall into the trap of thinking that you don't need, that it's really like a feasibility. It's real like well designed. It's for well developed plans with pilot data. Okay, I'll stop now. Thanks.
There is a question here on the Google Doc that Heidi about why we would report pilots. So I think what this question is saying is that why would you report the results of the pilots? And I don't think that's what anybody is advocating. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, it's what you're reporting is that you did piloting or what kinds of things you did. I'm not sure what the what the requirements are that you all are thinking about.
Yeah, I think I mean, I don't know if everyone is looking at the Google Doc, but essentially it's kind of alluding to the fact that like because it's kind of assumed that pilots are very kind of small, variable, what inference can you actually make from this? And so because of that, is it useful to kind of put in a final report? And I think that I mean, that's logical, it makes sense, and that's probably why reporting mechanisms don't exist, because of those intuitions. But I think what ends up happening is that people only report piloting right now when it aligns with their hypotheses. So you'll see it in a discussion, or you'll see it in a response to review, where there'll be like a sentence in a paper being like, oh, you might have concerns about this, but we know that that's not the case because of piloting. And so because there's no kind of reporting norms, you really only see piloting reported if it aligns to kind of beef up the claims in your paper. So I think what we're trying to encourage is just like broader transparency with like minimal reporting, just acknowledging that you pilot, because again, not everyone knows that people pilot, and that's the thing you can do, so that people can get more information to try and get whether or not the study 1 you're reporting is like study 1 or study 5, study 100. But again, the mechanics or the detail of like the results, the method, the change log or whatever, I think that's a problem of how, and we have to kind of think a little bit outside of traditional, like writing it up like we would a traditional journal article, and more so trying to figure out how to fit these within manuscripts to make it useful information.
Yeah, I think, and to add to that, I think there are also lots of things that happen during method development that can be incredibly useful for other researchers. There might be ineffective manipulations. There might be stimuli that don't work, that have ceiling effects, floor effects for particular age groups, for example, especially in developmental research. There might be, misunderstandings on participant side. I don't know, a picture was confusing, word was confusing. And I think reporting that sort of journey and all these decisions that were made in the process can also help others when they develop similar paradigms or paradigms building on your paradigm later on. I think Lisa mentioned the file drawer problem. I think this is exactly that, the same file drawer problem like we have with null effects. It's just that it's more about method development than the results. And exactly what ManyBabies said, of course, it also matters if it's a study 1 or study 100, depending on what happened on the way. So I think there will be a lot of sort of useful lessons for others there. And now I do think it's a very serious question on how we do it, also to not overwhelm ourselves and others with information, right? I mean, we cannot share our every single messy note from the whole piloting process. I mean, and just dump it online, right? I mean, is that going to be useful? So how do we structure that? And that's also something that I think it's a question for the whole community, right? Like, what is the best and most informative way to report that sort of journey of that method development or method feasibility testing, so that others can benefit from that, and so that you also show the sort of full transparency in the process in a reasonable way, right? So I think that is very very important.
Thank you, Agata, for adding these final thoughts. This brings us to the end of our discussion. Thank you very much for this very insightful conversation. And you will have the recordings, and please feel welcome to join any other ManyBabies events coming up next. Thanks to everyone who helped organizing these events, for example, Heidi and Quinn, and the members of the Teaching and Training Committee from the ManyBabies. And so I'll just wish you a very nice evening or day or wherever you are, night, hopefully not. Thank you so much.